The artistic expression and the influence of erotica on serial killers. Stick around. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sex Nerd Podcast. My name is Dr. Victoria Hartman, and today I'm going to cover two topics, but that influence one another, and it's in response to or includes aspects of a class that I taught last night at Cemetery Pulp. Some of you follow my channel know that I had been advertising that class, and what was surprising to me initially, which I'm not exactly sure why, was that the class was overbooked and they had filled the seats and double that amount. So half of the store was full of people, and people who walked in also bought seats afterwards. So this clearly is a topic of interest, and some folks were there specifically for the conversation around the art of serial killers. Now, we're going to cover two aspects of this because they influence each other. And I referenced, I don't know, a couple weeks ago that I was working on a book. And that book continues to coalesce and distinguish itself into pieces and parts. And last night was another one of those aspects of the book starting to take shape. Now, I should preface this episode by saying that so that I don't violate any of YouTube's community standards, I will not be showing any of the art that I'm referring to. And I won't be linking to them either. In this case, and this is not a plug for the book because I don't know when it's going to come out, but in this case, it'll have to wait. But what I am going to do is I'm going to reference an author or an expert, I suppose, who at first I was very skeptical of. But as I've had the time, I've been reading more of her work. And while I have some disagreement with her, overall, she has a pretty good perspective into the minds of serial killers. But I'm going to go off in a little different direction. So first, what I want to start off with, there's going to be three parts. One is art and the serial killer, one is erotica for serial killers, and one is going to be an exploration of the difference between the artwork of those who have come under the microscope of investigators from a clinicological perspective. I'm sorry, a criminological perspective, and those who don't, those who have not, those who consider themselves kinksters. Now, art and the serial killer isn't a new topic. Kathrine Ramsland has actually done an article on it, exploring how serial killers are using art to pass the time or to use it as a creative outlet while they're in prison. Rosemary West, who murdered young women with her husband in Britain, she won a sponge cake bake-off in prison. The Wichita Eagle ran an article that described book plates that Dennis Rader drew for his autobiography. She states that, in fact, quite a few serial killers have developed their creative talents while in prison, from making origami to choker necklaces to painting serene sunsets. The most renowned, of course, being killer clown John Wayne Gacy. He is most famous for his Pogo the Clown self-portraits, as well as his Hi-Ho series of Disney characters. There's one other serial killer who has done something similar with cartoonish type characters. His name is Haddon Clark. Elmer Wayne Henley, who assisted Candyman Dean Corll, says that art has calmed him and made him think of God, thus it elevates him. He likes to draw seascapes and surrealistic pictures, and apparently he's pretty good. Herbert Mullen, a California spree killer, with psychotic delusions, has also painted landscapes, although he reportedly has no eye for perspective, according to the author, or anything else. He still believes his 13 murders saved California. Now, she goes on in this article highlighting a number of different serial killers and their artwork. And I'm going to come back to this later because we're going to cross a line between this artwork and erotic artwork that's created by serial killers and erotic artwork that is not created by serial killers, and what differentiates those two. That said, we have to actually take a dive into erotica for serial killers before we talk about erotica created by serial killers. I refer again back to Kathrine Ramsland. She has looked into this issue, and she and I diverge in our opinion of this. She talks about one of Ted Bundy's final interviews that he had with Dr. James Dobson. He's known as a religious psychologist and crusader against pornography, and Ted Bundy explained to Dobson that he was negatively affected by pornography, as well as he had early exposure to True Detective magazines. Now, if you look up True Detective magazines, Dennis Rader actually also mentions those, that these True Detective magazines, especially one of them, depicted some of the images of a known serial killer before he had killed the models that he had hired for these pictures. Often they were bound up, etc. And he found these inspirational and arousing, BTK did. But also Ted Bundy mentioned True Detective magazines as well. Now, do these count as pornography? Well, they are often, they show terrified, buxom females bound, wearing tight or flimsy clothing. Bundy claimed that it was this imagery that launched him into his addiction to violence. He stated, pornography can reach in and snatch the kid out of any house today. He said, it snatched me out of my home. Now, Bundy is known for his complete lack of empathy and taking no responsibility for his actions. And a lot of people consider this sort of a last-ditch attempt to blame someone else for the crimes that he had committed. However, she points out accurately that any written or drawn work can influence someone in a different way. Horror movies could. True Detective magazines could. The Bible, as she points out, could influence someone who has these tendencies. Now, when you talk about the influence of pornography, criminologist Eric Hickey, who I've actually written an article for in one of his anthologies, he states in Serial Killers and Their Victims that millions of people read pornography without harming anyone. It can be a facilitator for one person while having no effect on others. Still, the fact that certain serial murderers have insisted that pornography was a major factor in their killing young women and children cannot be ignored, Eric Hickey states. In later work, Sex, Crimes, and Paraphilia, he concludes the addiction to pornography affects each individual differently. Complex events, curiosity, loneliness, and even low self-esteem may all combine to affect someone uniquely. I have done articles or episodes in the past addressing pornography addiction, sex addiction, etc. The argument that's being made in sexological circles, it's not actually a thing. It's the person's attitude towards this that makes them susceptible. So in other words, if you have someone who's more likely to feel shame over a certain sexual act because of their upbringing or their religious faith or what have you, they are more likely going to feel shame about their indulgences. The same goes for pornography addiction. If someone already has an issue with pornography that is based on their family upbringing, their social system, their religious faith, they're more likely to consider themselves addicted to these materials instead of other people who wake up in the morning, use it to masturbate, which research is indicating that pornography is largely used for masturbatory reasons. So with that knowledge, if someone's already struggling with their own sexuality, with their own desires to masturbate or their own kinks or whatever, and they indulge in pornography that's counter to the ethics or morals that they were raised with, and those things are incongruent, they're going to call themselves addicts, when it's really what they're bringing to the table that defines it as such, rather than the thing itself, in this case pornography, being the source of the addiction. Now, this is where Dr. Ramsland and I diverge, because her article to me is one-sided. Okay, she takes one side of the argument and doesn't mention that there are other journal papers and other scientists that are researching much the same thing who are finding the opposite. Okay, so she states here, in another study, it was found that the way these publications distorted sexual information and emphasized domination had a strong impact on adolescents who use them for sex education. However, Clarissa Smith, who's also a researcher who has done research on pornography in minor individuals, that it had little to no effect. So these two are in disagreement. She's only highlighting one side of the argument, so I have an issue with the genuineness of the articles that she's referring to and how she's framing this. Now, Stephen Gianangelo interviewed death row resident Rick in Real Life Monsters, a psychological examination of the serial murderer. Rick echoed other killers when he said that while these images were not the sole causal factor for serial murder, they aid in furthering the growth of objectification. Even something as innocuous as a horror movie, he said, can have more impact than nonviolent porn if it objectifies and dehumanizes women in violent scenarios. Rick believed Bundy's description because he'd seen how detective magazines could open the primitive door. Some people, he said, are vulnerable. Now, I referred earlier to what BTK had to say about his exposure to true crime magazines. Rader told Kathrine Ramsland for Confessions of a Serial Killer that he found detective magazines under the driver's seat of his father's car. One day, he'd spotted a 1959 issue of Front Page Detective. He grabbed it to look at the cover photo. It showed a terrified woman bound and gagged. The feature story, The Sex-Crazed Photographer and His Graveyard of Models, was about Harvey Glattman, which I couldn't remember at the beginning of the episode. Rader had taken this magazine out to the shed to read as he performed self-asphyxiation. He reported that it was the greatest sexual rush he had ever achieved. He finally acted out his murder fantasies in 1974, continuing until 1991. Whenever he got into the murder mood, she writes, he would go look at these magazines. Another one inspired his ideas for a way to hold victims captive. My fantasy dungeon, he said, would be a silo next to a barn with different levels of torture chambers. Sex Beast, Melvin Rees Jr., a jazz musician, killer of 7 during the 1950s, blamed detective magazines as well, which he read compulsively. Between their images of tortured women and the methamphetamine he'd take, he'd become obsessed with forcing women to do his will. Among his victims was a family of 4. Now, again, she goes into many descriptions of these serial killers and some of the influences that they claim affected them around erotica. And that leads me into the next part of this episode, which is one of the overarching questions in the class last night is, how do we know someone's going to cross that line? Where's that line where those influences push someone into actually committing these crimes? And the answer that I had was, we don't know. We're trying to figure that out, because as I have been looking at the artworks of serial killers that are sexual and non-sexual, the only difference between those and artistic depictions of equal or greater violence, sexual or non-sexual, is the fact that the individual either did or didn't commit the violent crime. That's the only distinguishing fact. Other than that, a lot of this artwork looks the same. We have a couple of artists that are coming into the museum. One is notorious for his religious violence, sexual violence. He's online as Kerbcrawlerghost. He's going to be part of our Blacklist Artist Gallery. And his artwork is probably equally or more violent than some of the artworks, the erotic artworks that I've seen that were created actually by serial killers. So that was the question. I was peppered with questions from people last night that were asking me, is there an evolutionary reason? Is there a psychological reason? Is there a psychiatric reason? A neurological? Is there neuroscience? Why would someone maybe do this? Now, a colleague of mine is a neuroscientist, and he does a lot of MRI imaging, and the only thing that they've found that's different between, say, those who are violent and have committed violent crime and those who haven't is their pain sensitivity, how much or how little they actually perceive pain, at least from a neurological perspective. So is that one of the reasons why there's a crossover? Because and I'm not going to get into the rest of the book, you'll have to buy it, but that seems to be that distinguishing, the only thing that distinguishes these pieces of art is whether or not that person has committed a violent crime or not. So the question, how do we know? We don't. And can we make a judgment that someone is likely to commit violent crime because of the art that they put out, whether it's erotic or not? Not really. Not really. And I'm sure that's frustrating. Maybe there's a criminological aspect that I'm not aware of, but at least from an initial assessment and being a scholar who's studied the erotic artwork of those who have a death kink, these artworks, whether they're photographs or art or anything that was creative, there's nothing distinguishing the two. So can we make an assessment? It doesn't seem like it to me. Perhaps if you add a psychological profile to it, perhaps. But until that actually happens, I don't know that there's any way to distinguish between the two without knowing a long history of the individual themselves. Now, if they've committed acts of violence against animals, perhaps that might be a distinguishing difference. Now, one of the other guests actually brought up something really interesting and asked, what about opportunity? I would argue that opportunity probably plays a big role. Another guest asked whether or not these crimes are more likely to be committed in rural areas, urban areas, or suburban areas. I don't know that there's any research out there of that nature, although I would be curious. So if any of my viewers are aware of that kind of research, please send it my way, because I'd be curious to know. But I think it's a whole host of factors. So when we get back to the artwork of serial killers, some institutions have penalized serial killers for their disseminating artwork because they can make money on it. Some have argued, as she states in her article, that the families who lost a loved one don't want these individuals making a living or even a good living off of artwork that might potentially depict what they've done. Like I said, I brought up a whole host of art and artworks and individuals who created them at the lecture last night, and there was huge interest in it. But many of the questions always came back to, what's the difference? Where do you see when they crossed over? And as far as I can assess at this point, you really can't unless you have a background, a psychological background of the individual, whether or not there's been crime committed before, and in what form that takes. So the question continues to be ongoing. It's really opened up a lot of doors of thought for me around the book that I'm writing and some of the individuals I've researched and the various shades that they come in. And it's a curious phenomenon that continues to fascinate, as well as opens the door to more questions. So the questions continue, the curiosity continues. I'll be diving more deeply into it. I'll probably do some follow-up episodes. Actually, Cemetery Pulp afterwards asked, because the class was so popular, if I would do more on the same topic. So it looks like I will be doing repeat classes. However, the next one will be with new information, new artwork, additional things that I'll be looking into. So, and a lot of, like I said in a previous episode, reading a book, many books actually. With that final thought, I'm going to leave you for today. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Sex Nerd Podcast. And I will see you right back here next time.